The alarm on the bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy screamed before I even opened my eyes. I rolled off my bunk, boots already on, because on this ship you slept ready or you did not sleep at all. Red light washed the corridor as I ran, and through the thin metal walls I could hear the Valkyrie crew shouting numbers in their clipped, musical language. Numbers were never good. Numbers meant something was coming. I reached the command deck out of breath, the only human among 11 other officers, and Captain Ellen Frost turned to look at me with an expression I had learned to dread. It was not fear. Frost did not do fear. It was pity, and pity from her always came before bad news. "Enemy contact, 3 light minutes out," she said. "Thresher scout. Small. Fast. It saw us first." On the main display, a single red mark blinked at the edge of our sensor range, already turning away, already gone, before we could respond. A scout. Just a scout. But scouts meant a fleet was not far behind, and everyone on that bridge knew what a Thresher fleet meant, for whatever world it found first. I asked the question nobody wanted to answer. Which world are they moving toward? Silence. Then the navigation officer, a tall Odrone with skin like polished stone, pulled up a star chart without meeting my eyes. 3 systems sat inside the projected path. 2 were core coalition worlds, heavily defended, thick with orbital platforms and veteran fleets. The 3rd was Earth. I did not say anything. I did not need to. I watched 11 pairs of alien eyes glance at me, and then quickly look away. The way people look away from something broken, they feel a little sorry for. In the 2 years I had served on this ship, I had grown used to that look. Humans were the newest members of the Concord, and by every measure the Coalition used to judge a species, we were the weakest. Our lifespans were short, our bodies broke easily, our ships were young, and our weapons unremarkable next to Valkyrie plasma arrays or Audran gravity lances. We had been allowed into the Alliance not because we impressed anyone, but because the Concord needed numbers against the Threshers, and a species willing to fight was better than no species at all. I had heard the whispers in the mess hall. I had heard them in the corridors, spoken in careless tones by crew members who assumed the human girl either could not understand their dialects or would not mind if she did. Soft, they called us. Sentimental. A species that flinched, a species that would break the first time real pressure was applied. Captain Frost cleared her throat, and I realized she was waiting for me to say something, because I was the one human voice on a ship about to decide the fate of a human colony. "Send the warning to Earth," I said. "Immediately. Full sensor data, projected course, estimated arrival." Frost hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a breath, but I caught it, and it told me everything about how this council truly weighed the value of one human world against 2 others. "The signal will take time to reach them," she said carefully. "By the time Earth receives it and responds, the Thresher fleet may already be within striking range of your colony." "Then they need every second we can give them," I said. "Send it now." She nodded, and the order went out. But I noticed something else in that moment, something small that I filed away and did not understand until much later. Nobody on that bridge suggested diverting our own ship to help defend Earth. Nobody suggested pulling resources from the 2 core worlds to reinforce the colony. The math had already been done somewhere above my rank, quietly, without my input, and the math had decided that Earth was expendable in a way the others were not. I went back to my quarters that night, if you could call the cramped alloy box with a bunk and a single viewport quarters, and I sat staring out at the stars for a long time. Somewhere out there, beyond my ability to see, a scout ship was reporting our position and our numbers to a hive fleet that had never once been stopped in open battle. Every coalition engagement against the Threshers had ended the same way. Worlds evacuated, worlds lost, worlds sometimes simply gone, swallowed whole, the survivors left with nothing but static where a planet used to be. I thought about my mother in Denver, my brother stationed somewhere in orbital defense, The friends I had grown up with, who had never left Earth, and had no idea that a decision affecting their lives had just been made in a council room light years away, decided by people who did not consider their world worth the same effort as any other. I thought about sending a private message home, something personal, something that was not encoded in official channels and stiff military language. I drafted 3 different versions and deleted all of them. What could I possibly say? Run? There was nowhere to run to. Prepare? For what, exactly? Nobody in the history of the Concord had ever prepared successfully for a Thresher invasion. The best any world had managed was an orderly retreat, and even that had cost lives beyond counting. In the morning, the response came back from Earth Defense Command, and it was so short that at first I thought it must be an error, a fragment of a longer message lost in transmission. Coordinates confirmed. Deployment schedule attached. We have this. Tell them to watch. I read it 4 times. I showed it to Captain Frost, who read it twice and then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between confusion and the beginning of concern. "This is not a request for support," she said slowly. "No," I said, "it isn't. They are not asking for reinforcements. They are not asking for evacuation ships. They have not even asked what the projected size of the enemy fleet is." "No," I said again, because I did not have a better answer. I did not understand it either. Every instinct I had built up over 2 years of serving among species far more advanced than my own told me that a lightly defended colony world facing a Thresher fleet alone should be sending desperate pleas for any help it could get. Instead, Earth Defense Command had sent 17 words and a deployment schedule, as if this were routine, as if this were expected. Frost forwarded the message up the chain, and within hours it had reached the full Concord Council, the body of representatives from every member species that set policy for the entire alliance. I was not present for that meeting, but I heard about it afterward from an Odran officer who had access to the transcript, and what she told me chilled me more than the original alarm had. The Council, she said, had debated whether to redirect any coalition assets toward Earth at all. Some had argued it would be a waste of resources to reinforce a colony that would likely be lost regardless. Resources better spent shoring up the 2 core worlds that actually mattered to the wider war effort. Others had argued, more coldly still, that losing the human colony might serve a purpose, buying time for those other worlds to complete their evacuations while the Threshers were occupied elsewhere. Nobody, apparently, had argued strongly enough to change the outcome. The vote had gone against sending aid. Earth's colony would stand alone, and if it fell, the Council would treat the loss as an acceptable cost of war, a sacrifice made on humanity's behalf, without humanity ever being asked whether it was willing to make that sacrifice. I sat with that knowledge for 2 full days before I could bring myself to speak to anyone about it. I thought about the strange, calm reply Earth Defense Command had sent. Tell them to watch. Watch what, exactly? I began to wonder if perhaps Earth's leadership did not yet understand the scale of what was coming, if perhaps they were simply too far removed from the front lines of this war to grasp how thoroughly outmatched their small colony would be. But there was another possibility, one I could not shake, one that kept me awake at night staring at that same starfield outside my viewport. What if they understood perfectly well and had answered that way anyway, not out of ignorance, but out of something else entirely? Something the rest of the galaxy had never bothered to ask about, because they had already decided, long before they had any real evidence, that humanity was too weak to be worth the question. On the 3rd day, new sensor data arrived, relayed from a coalition monitoring station near the edge of human space. The Thresher fleet had grown. What had begun as a modest incursion force now numbered in the hundreds of vessels, hive ships and swarm carriers moving in the same terrible formation that had broken every other coalition defense in living memory. Their course remained unchanged. They were still heading directly for the human colony, ignoring the 2 core worlds entirely, as if something about Earth's territory had specifically drawn their attention. I stood on the bridge and watched that swarm crawl slowly across the display, red marks multiplying by the hour, and I felt something twist in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but sat somewhere close to both. Around me, the alien officers of the Aurelian's Mercy watched the same display with expressions I recognized instantly, because I had seen that look turn toward me and my species more times than I could count. They were watching a doomed world, and they expected, without question, to see it fall. I turned away from the display and walked back toward the communications bay, because there was one more thing I intended to do before this was over, whatever the outcome turned out to be. I intended to make sure that whatever happened next, out there at the edge of human space, would not happen in silence. If the galaxy was going to watch humanity meet its fate, then I was going to make certain every species in this alliance saw exactly what that fate turned out to be. I requested a live sensor feed be routed to the bridge display, full resolution, no filtering, no delay beyond the natural limits of distance and light. Captain Frost approved it without argument, though I caught something new in her eyes when she did, a flicker of curiosity that had not been there before. "You want everyone to see this," she said. "I want everyone to see the truth," I answered, "whatever that truth turns out to be." She held my gaze a moment longer than necessary, and then she nodded, and the feed was authorized, and across a dozen coalition vessels scattered through this sector of space, screens began to light up with the same image, a small, unassuming human colony, sitting quietly in the path of an overwhelming storm, waiting for whatever was coming next. None of us on that bridge had any idea what we were actually about to witness. The colony was called Haven Ridge, a modest settlement of nearly 2 million people spread across rolling farmland and 3 coastal cities on a world humanity had claimed only 40 years earlier. I had never been there myself, but I had studied the files during the long hours after that first warning went out, partly out of duty and partly because I needed something to do with my hands while my mind kept circling back to the same unanswerable question. Why had Earth Defense Command sounded so calm? Colonel Grant Hale commanded the ground and orbital defenses at Haven Ridge, and it was his voice that came through on the recorded briefing I was given clearance to review. He did not sound like a man preparing his people for annihilation. He sounded like a man running through a checklist he had rehearsed 100 times before, methodical and unhurried, giving orders in short, clear sentences to officers who responded without hesitation or panic. "Evacuation transports depart on schedule," he said. "Non-combatant personnel to shelter zones by 0600. All defense platforms report status by 0700. This is not a drill, and it is not a retreat. Confirm." I watched officer after officer confirm without a trace of fear in their voices, and I began to understand that whatever was happening on Haven Ridge, it had been planned for a very long time, long before this particular Thresher fleet had ever been detected. This was not a colony caught by surprise. This was a colony that had built its entire existence around the assumption that a day like this would eventually come. On the bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy, the alien officers watched the same feeds I did, and I noticed their questions changing in tone as the hours passed. At first, they had asked why Earth was not requesting help. Now they began asking something else entirely. "Why are there so many defense platforms?" The Audran navigation officer asked me directly, her stone-colored features arranged in an expression I had learned to read as genuine confusion. Our records on human colonial development suggested minimal orbital infrastructure at this stage of settlement. This is inconsistent. I did not have a good answer for her, because I had noticed the same thing and could not explain it either. According to every file the Concord had on record, Haven Ridge should have possessed a handful of light defense satellites and perhaps a single orbital shipyard still under construction. Instead, sensor sweeps were now revealing dozens of platforms in high orbit, their configurations unfamiliar even to coalition analysts who had spent decades cataloging human military technology. "Maybe our records are outdated," I said, which was true as far as it went, though it felt like a smaller answer than the situation deserved. Captain Frost called a private meeting that evening, just the two of us, in her small office off the main bridge, and she asked me a question I had been dreading since the moment that first strange reply arrived from Earth Defense Command. "Mara," she said, using my given name for the first time since I had come aboard, which told me she considered this conversation to be personal rather than professional. "Is there something about your species that the Concord does not know?" I thought carefully before answering, because I genuinely did not know the full truth myself, only fragments and rumors I had heard growing up, stories my grandfather used to tell about the wars humanity had fought against itself before the stars ever opened up to us, wars that had taught bitter lessons about preparation and restraint that no other species in this alliance had ever needed to learn the same way. "I think," I said slowly, "that humanity spent most of its history fighting itself before we ever met anyone else. I think we learned things about survival that other species never had reason to learn, because other species never needed to. And I think we have been very careful, since joining the Concord, about how much of that history we chose to share." Frost studied me for a long moment. "Careful or ashamed?" "Maybe both," I admitted. "Or maybe we simply never saw the need. Nobody asks the weakest member of an alliance to explain their darkest chapters. Nobody expects the weakest member to have chapters like that at all." She did not respond to that immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the small viewport in her office, looking out at the same stars I had been staring at for 3 sleepless nights, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its usual crisp authority. "I have served in this fleet for 60 years, she said. "I have seen coalition worlds fall to the threshers 11 times. I have watched entire evacuation fleets destroyed while trying to save even a fraction of a planet's population. I have never once seen a colony prepare for an invasion the way Haven Ridge is preparing right now. Calm, organized, almost eager." "Eager seems like a strange word," I said. "It is the only word that fits," she replied, "and it frightens me more than the Thresher fleet does." I did not sleep much that night, turning her words over in my mind, wondering what exactly she had seen in those defense platform readings that I had missed. In the morning, new data confirmed what the navigation officer had first noticed. The orbital defenses around Haven Ridge were not merely more numerous than expected. They were arranged in patterns that coalition tactical analysts could not fully interpret, formations that seemed to serve no immediate defensive purpose according to standard doctrine, until someone on the analysis team suggested they might not be purely defensive at all. The Thresher fleet crossed into the outer edge of the Haven Ridge system on the 4th day, and the entire bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy fell silent as the sensor feed sharpened enough to show individual vessel signatures. Hundreds of hive ships, arranged in the same rolling, overwhelming formation that had broken every coalition defense before it, moved steadily toward the small blue and green world at the heart of the system. I forced myself to watch every second of it, because I had promised myself I would not look away, no matter what happened next. Colonel Hale's voice came through on an open channel that Earth Defense Command had, strangely, chosen to broadcast across coalition monitoring networks rather than keep encrypted, and I understood immediately that this was deliberate. Earth wanted the galaxy watching. Earth wanted every species in the Concord to see this unfold with their own eyes, unfiltered and unedited. "All stations, this is Hale," his voice said, calm as ever. "Enemy fleet entering engagement range in 11 minutes. Confirm defense grid status." One by one, station commanders reported in, their voices carrying no hint of the panic I would have expected from people facing an enemy that had never once been defeated in open battle. Instead, I heard something closer to focus, the kind of steady readiness I associated with people who had trained for this exact moment more times than they could count. Grid Alpha, green. Grid Beta, green. Grid Gamma, green. All evacuation transports report clear of the engagement zone, a woman's voice added, and I recognized it as Major Claire Bishop, the officer coordinating civilian withdrawal. Non-combatant casualties at 0. Shelter compliance at 98%. 98%. On a colony of nearly 2 million people, with an enemy fleet bearing down on them, they had managed to move 98% of the civilian population into shelter or evacuation before the fighting had even begun. I had read enough coalition after-action reports to know that no other species in this alliance had ever achieved anything close to that number under similar circumstances. Usually, by the time an evacuation order went out, it was already too late for a meaningful fraction of the population. "Something is wrong here," the Audra navigation officer said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, but I heard the words clearly across the bridge. "This is not how a weaker species prepares for an unwinnable engagement. This is how a species prepares for a battle it expects to survive." I did not answer her, because I was watching the display, watching those hundreds of thresher vessels close the final distance toward Haven Ridge, and I realized my hands had curled into fists at my sides without my noticing. Colonel Hale's voice came through one final time before the thresher fleet crossed into what the tactical display marked as the engagement threshold, and something in his tone shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "All stations," he said, "hold position. Hold fire until my mark. Let them come all the way in." "Sir," a younger voice interrupted, tight with what might have been the first genuine trace of nerves I had heard from anyone at Haven Ridge. "They will be within striking range of the coastal cities in under 6 minutes, if we let them advance that far." "I am aware of the timeline, Lieutenant," Hale replied, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, the voice of a man reassuring a subordinate rather than issuing a cold command. "Trust the plan. We have run this exercise more times than you have been alive. Hold position." The bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy had gone completely silent now, every officer, human and alien alike, staring at the same display as the Thresher fleet advanced deeper into the system, past the outer defense platforms, past the orbital shipyards, closer and closer to a world that seemed, by every visible measure, to be doing absolutely nothing to stop them. I felt Captain Frost's hand come to rest briefly on my shoulder, and when I glanced at her, I saw an expression I had never once seen on her face in 2 years of service together. It was not pity anymore. It was something closer to awe, tangled together with a fear she was too disciplined to voice aloud. "Mara," she said quietly, "I think we are about to learn something about your species that no one in this alliance has ever understood before." On the display, the Thresher fleet crossed the final threshold, moving into what should have been an easy, unopposed advance toward an undefended world. And then, on Colonel Hale's mark, every single defense platform around Haven Ridge opened fire at once. Light bloomed across the display in patterns I had never seen before, not the wide, indiscriminate energy bursts I associated with coalition weaponry, but tight, coordinated strikes that seemed to know exactly where to land before the Thresher formation had even finished registering the attack. Every platform around Haven Ridge fired in sequence rather than all at once, a rolling wave of precision that swept through the outer edge of the enemy formation and left gaps where entire clusters of hive ships had been moments before. On the bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy, nobody spoke. I do not think anybody breathed. "That is not standard coalition targeting doctrine," the Odran navigation officer finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is not standard anything. Look at the interval between strikes. Look at the way each platform waits for confirmation before the next one fires. They are not overwhelming the formation with volume. They are dismantling it, piece by piece, in an order that maximizes disruption to enemy coordination." I did not fully understand the tactical language, but I understood what I was seeing. The Thresher fleet, which had never in recorded coalition history failed to break through a planetary defense, was faltering. Its formation, always so terrifyingly uniform, so relentless in every previous engagement, had begun to fracture into confused clusters, hive ships colliding with their own escorts as coordination signals were cut off one after another. Colonel Hale's voice returned to the open channel, steady as ever, though now I could hear something underneath the calm, a current of controlled intensity that had not been there before. Second wave, execute. Bishop, confirm shelter integrity. Shelter integrity, holding at 100%, Major Bishop replied instantly. No structural compromise reported anywhere in the grid. A second wave of strikes lit up the display, this time aimed deeper into the Thresher formation, and I watched as entire hive ships, vessels large enough to carry thousands of the creatures within them, simply stopped moving, their systems overwhelmed by something the Coalition sensors could not fully identify. Not destroyed outright, disabled, cut off, left drifting and helpless in the black, while the rest of the formation scrambled to respond to an attack pattern it had clearly never encountered before. "They are being herded," Captain Frost said suddenly, and I turned to look at her, because her voice had taken on an edge of realization I had not heard from her before. "Look at the gaps in the strike pattern. They are not attacking randomly. They are shaping where the Thresher ships can and cannot go. They are pushing the entire fleet towards something." I looked at the display more closely and saw what she meant. The disabled and disrupted sections of the Thresher formation were being funneled, almost gently, toward a narrow region of space between two of the largest defense platforms, a corridor that on the surface looked like nothing more than an empty stretch of vacuum. It was not empty. As the confused remnants of the Thresher advance drifted into that corridor, new signatures bloomed on the sensor display. Dozens of small vessels that had been running dark, invisible to every scan the Coalition ship possessed, until this exact moment. Human fighters, sleek and quick, moving with a precision that made the larger Thresher hive ships look slow and lumbering by comparison. "Second Squadron, you are cleared," Colonel Hale said. "Bring them home." What followed was unlike anything I had studied in 2 years of Coalition military history. The human fighters did not charge in with the kind of overwhelming aggressive force I had expected, the desperate all-or-nothing assault of a cornered species with nothing left to lose. Instead, they moved with an economy of motion that reminded me, strangely, of the way Colonel Hale had spoken from the very first moment this engagement began. Controlled, deliberate, almost patient, even now, even in the middle of the largest battle Haven Ridge had ever faced. They targeted the command and coordination sections of each disabled hive ship first, methodically cutting off whatever passed for the Thresher equivalent of leadership before moving to the next cluster. Within minutes, what had been a single overwhelming fleet had become dozens of isolated, leaderless fragments, each one drifting further from any hope of coordinated response. "I do not understand," the Audran officer said, and for the first time since I had met her, she sounded genuinely shaken. "The Threshers have never fought like this before. They have never been isolated like this before. Every previous engagement, every single one on record, the Coalition forces were overwhelmed by sheer numbers before any tactic like this could even be attempted. How is this fleet failing to overwhelm them?" I did not have an answer for her, not a complete one, but I was beginning to understand a piece of it. Watching those human fighters move with such calm precision through a battle that should have been unwinnable. This was not a first attempt. This was not improvisation born of desperation. Every maneuver I watched unfold had the unmistakable rhythm of something rehearsed 1,000 times before, refined across years or perhaps decades of preparation for a threat that Earth's leadership had apparently always known would eventually arrive. "They have been planning for this exact scenario," I said slowly, thinking aloud more than truly speaking to anyone. "Not this specific battle, but this exact kind of enemy. An overwhelming force with no regard for its own losses, relying entirely on numbers and coordination to break any defense. Earth built its entire strategy around countering that specific weakness, long before they ever knew the Threshers existed." "That is not possible," the navigation officer said. No species prepares that thoroughly for an enemy they have never encountered. Humanity has fought enemies like that before, I said quietly, just not from beyond our own world. Captain Frost turned to look at me sharply, and I realized I had said more than I intended, opened a door I had spent 2 years carefully keeping shut. But there was no time to explain further, because the battle on the display had entered a new phase, and every officer on the bridge turned their attention back to it. The remaining Thresher Hive ships, now fragmented and disorganized, began attempting what looked like a retreat, scattering away from Haven Ridge in different directions, no longer moving as a single overwhelming force, but as dozens of desperate individual vessels trying to escape whatever had just happened to the rest of their fleet. It was the first time, according to every record the Coalition possessed, that a Thresher fleet had ever attempted to withdraw from an engagement rather than press forward regardless of losses. "They are trying to run," Frost said, disbelief plain in her voice. "Colonel Hale will not let them," I found myself saying, though I had no direct knowledge that this was true, only a growing certainty built from everything I had watched unfold over the past several minutes. I was right. A third wave of human vessels emerged from positions further out in the system, larger ships this time, cutting off the scattered retreat routes with the same calm, unhurried precision that had characterized every other stage of this engagement. Colonel Hale's voice came through the channel one final time before the battle reached its conclusion, and this time there was something in his tone that I had not expected, not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter and more serious than either of those. "All units, minimize further losses on both sides where possible," he said. "Disable, do not destroy, wherever the tactical situation allows. Bishop, prepare medical and containment teams for enemy survivors. We are not finished with this engagement, but I want it finished properly." I heard the Odrin navigation officer make a small sound of confusion beside me. "Containment teams for enemy survivors, he intends to take prisoners from a Thresher fleet. No Coalition force has ever successfully taken a Thresher prisoner," Captain Frost said slowly, working through the implications even as she spoke them aloud. "Every previous engagement ended in either the enemy fleet's total victory or its total destruction. There has never been a middle outcome. There has never been an opportunity to capture and study a living Thresher combatant." "There is now," I said, watching as the remaining scattered hive ships, unable to escape and unable to regroup, began powering down their weapon systems one after another, a strange and unprecedented surrender playing out in real time on the sensor display in front of us. The battle for Haven Ridge lasted just under 2 hours, from the moment the first shot was fired to the moment the last Thresher vessel went dark and drifted, disabled but intact, within the containment perimeter Colonel Hale's forces had established around it. 2 hours against a fleet that had taken entire Coalition worlds apart in a fraction of that time in every previous engagement on record. Civilian casualties at Haven Ridge, according to the final report that came through hours later, numbered exactly 0. Not reduced, not minimized. 0. Nearly 2 million people had faced an invasion fleet that had never once been stopped before, and every single one of them had survived. I stood on the bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy long after the engagement had ended, watching the final tally scroll across the display, and I became aware, slowly, that the entire crew around me had gone completely silent, staring at numbers that did not match anything in their understanding of how this war was supposed to work. Captain Frost was the first to break the silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight I had never heard from her before. Not fear exactly, and not quite awe, but something built from both. "In 60 years of service," she said, "I have never seen a Coalition victory that cost this little. I have never seen an evacuation this complete. I have never seen an enemy fleet broken this thoroughly without a single world being lost in the process." She turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had come aboard this ship, I saw something in her expression that I had never once expected to see directed at me, or at anyone from my species. "What exactly did your people learn?" she asked quietly, fighting themselves before the stars ever opened up. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about the wars he used to describe in careful, measured tones, wars that had taught humanity terrible lessons about preparation, about restraint, about the difference between what a species was capable of doing and what it chose to do instead. I thought about Colonel Hale's voice, calm through every second of an engagement that should have terrified anyone, and about his final order before the battle ended, an order to minimize losses, to take prisoners, to finish this properly rather than simply finish it. "I think," I said slowly, "that we learned exactly how bad things could get if we let them, and I think we decided, a very long time ago, that we would never let them get that bad again if we could help it." Around the bridge, the alien officers who had spent 2 years looking at me with quiet pity now looked at me with something else entirely, and across the wider coalition, I knew, similar conversations were beginning to unfold on every ship that had watched the same feed we had. The galaxy had just witnessed the weakest member of its alliance do something no other species had ever managed against the Threshers, and nobody watching had any idea yet how much further this was about to go. 3 weeks after the battle at Haven Ridge, a single Thresher vessel appeared at the edge of human space, unarmed, broadcasting a distress signal on every frequency it could manage and requesting direct contact with Earth Defense Command. It did not approach the Concord Council. It did not request an audience with any of the older, more established coalition species who had fought the Threshers for decades. It went straight to the species that had, for the first time in this entire war, actually stopped them. I learned about it through Captain Frost, who called me into her office with an expression I had come to recognize over the past 3 weeks. A mixture of curiosity and something like anticipation that I suspected mirrored what half the ships in the coalition fleet were feeling as word of Haven Ridge continued to spread. "The Council is furious," she told me, not bothering to soften the observation. A member species bypassed proper diplomatic channels entirely. The Threshers went directly to Earth, and Earth accepted the contact without waiting for Council authorization. "Can they even do that?" I asked. "Bypass the Council, I mean. Apparently, the Threshers can do whatever they like, given that nobody has ever negotiated with them before," Frost said. "There is no established protocol for a Thresher surrender, because there has never been a Thresher surrender. Earth is writing the rules as they go, and the Council does not appreciate being left out of the process." I understood the Council's frustration, even as I found myself feeling something closer to pride at the idea of Earth handling this on its own terms. For as long as I had served among the Coalition, humanity had been treated as a junior member, welcome to contribute soldiers and ships, but rarely consulted on matters of real strategic importance. Now the very enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for years was reaching out to the one species everyone had once dismissed as the weakest in the alliance, and doing so without asking anyone else's permission first. "They have requested a human liaison be present for the negotiations," Frost continued. "Someone with coalition experience, who can help translate not just language but expectation between Earth and the wider Council once terms are reached. Command has selected you." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle over me slowly. 2 years earlier, I had been assigned to this ship as little more than a token gesture, proof that humanity was participating in coalition operations even if nobody expected much to come of it. Now I was being sent to help negotiate the surrender of a species that had never once, in living memory, surrendered to anyone. "When do I leave?" I asked. "Immediately," Frost said. "And Mara, whatever you find there, whatever you learn about your own people in that room, I want you to remember something before you go." "What is that?" This ship watched Haven Ridge with genuine fear that we were about to see a colony destroyed, she said. "We were wrong about that. But do not assume, because we were wrong once, that everyone in this alliance has updated their opinion of your species yet. Old fears change slowly, even in the face of new evidence. Her warning stayed with me through the entire journey to the negotiation site, a neutral station positioned between coalition and human territory, hastily converted for this purpose because nothing else existed that both sides considered acceptable ground. When I arrived, I found a delegation already assembled, 3 representatives from Earth Defense Command, 4 from the Thresher vessel, and a handful of Concord Council observers who had insisted, despite Earth's evident preference to handle this alone, on being present to monitor proceedings. Colonel Hale himself led the human delegation, and meeting him in person for the first time, I understood immediately why his voice had carried such calm authority through every moment of the Haven Ridge engagement. He was an unremarkable-looking man in most respects, gray at the temples, quiet in his movements, but there was a stillness to him that reminded me of deep water, the kind that looked calm on the surface precisely because of how much pressure it was containing underneath. "Ambassador Voss," he said, extending a hand as I entered the negotiation chamber. "Thank you for coming on short notice. I am not sure I qualify as an ambassador yet, Colonel," I said. "You qualify the moment the job requires you to," he replied, with the faint trace of a smile that suggested he understood exactly how strange the past 3 weeks had been for me. "Please, sit. This is going to be an unusual conversation." The Thresher delegation looked nothing like the terrifying, faceless swarm I had imagined from years of coalition reports describing them only in terms of their overwhelming numbers and their willingness to sacrifice endless waves of their own kind without hesitation. Up close, they were tall, angular creatures with pale, segmented skin and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence far greater than anything the Coalition's dismissive reports had ever suggested. Their lead representative introduced itself through a translation device as something close to vessel speaker, and when it spoke, its tone carried an unmistakable note that I recognized instantly, because I had heard it before, directed at humanity by nearly every species in the Concord: desperation. "We did not expect resistance of this kind," vessel speaker said, its translated voice flat, but carrying an edge that suggested genuine strain beneath the mechanical delivery. "In every previous engagement across this war, coalition forces were overwhelmed, regardless of preparation. Your species achieved something none of them accomplished. We request terms. We request an end to hostilities between our people and yours." Colonel Hale listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing, and when vessel speaker finished, he took a long moment before responding, a silence that stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. "Before we discuss terms," he said finally, "I want to understand something. Your fleet did not retreat from Haven Ridge because it ran out of ships. It retreated because, for the first time in this war, it encountered a defense it could not overcome through numbers alone. Is that correct?" "It is correct," vessel speaker said. "And in every previous engagement, when your forces overwhelmed a coalition world, did you offer terms to the defenders? Did you allow for surrender, for evacuation, for any resolution other than total destruction?" The silence that followed was heavy enough that I felt it settle across the entire chamber, even the Concord Council observers going still as they waited for an answer. "No," vessel speaker said eventually. "Our directive has always been complete conquest. Mercy was never offered because mercy was never a consideration our leadership believed necessary." I watched Colonel Hale's expression carefully during that exchange, waiting for some flicker of anger, some sign of the satisfaction I half expected from a man hearing his enemy admit, plainly, that they had shown no restraint whatsoever toward every world they had ever conquered. Instead, I saw something quieter, something that looked almost like sorrow, though I could not be entirely certain. "I understand," he said simply. "Now I want you to understand something in return. My forces at Haven Ridge disabled the majority of your fleet rather than destroying it outright. We took prisoners rather than simply eliminating your combatants once they were no longer capable of resistance. That was not an accident, and it was not a limitation of our capability. We had the means to destroy every ship in your fleet completely. We chose not to. Vessel Speaker's angular head tilted slightly, an alien gesture I could not fully interpret, but that seemed to carry genuine confusion. Why? Because we are not the same as your fleet, Hale said. Because being capable of something and choosing to do it are not the same thing, and my species has spent a very long time learning the difference between those two ideas, often at great cost. We are prepared to discuss terms that allow your people to withdraw, to be held accountable through coalition processes, and to eventually seek some path back toward coexistence, provided your leadership demonstrates genuine willingness to change how your species conducts itself in this war. One of the Concord Council observers, a Velkari representative who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up, his translated voice carrying an edge of alarm. Colonel Hale, this is a significant departure from established Concord policy regarding the Threshers. Previous Council resolutions called for complete neutralization of Thresher military capacity, not negotiated coexistence. With respect, Hale replied, turning to address the Council observer directly for the first time. The Council's previous resolutions were written by species that had never once stopped a Thresher fleet in open engagement. My people have now done exactly that, and we intend to handle the resulting negotiation according to principles we have found reliable across a very long history of conflict, rather than according to policy written by people who have only ever experienced defeat against this enemy. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence, and I found myself watching the Council observer's expression shift from alarm to something more complicated, a recognition, perhaps for the first time, that the balance of authority within this alliance had genuinely changed, and that humanity no longer intended to simply defer to coalition policy the way it had for the past several years. Vessel Speaker spoke again, and this time its translated tone carried something I had not expected to hear from a species the coalition had spent years describing, purely in terms of relentless aggression. We did not anticipate that the species we considered weakest among the coalition would be the one to show restraint where our own leadership never did, it said. We ask again, formally, for terms of surrender under the conditions Colonel Hale has described. I sat quietly through the remainder of that session, watching Colonel Hale outline conditions with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the Haven Ridge engagement, terms that called for gradual disarmament, coalition oversight of Thresher territory, restitution processes for previously conquered worlds, and a long path toward eventual reintegration rather than permanent exile or destruction. It was, by any measure I understood, an extraordinarily generous set of terms to offer a species that had shown none of that same generosity to anyone else across the entire war. When the session finally ended and the Thresher delegation departed to relay these terms back to their leadership, the Concord Council observers lingered, and I caught fragments of their conversation as they gathered their materials, uncertain whether I was meant to overhear it or whether they simply no longer cared who listened. They had every justification to destroy that fleet completely, one of them said. Every precedent in this war supported total elimination as the only viable response. And yet they chose otherwise, another replied, because they could. Because choosing otherwise was always available to them, in a way it apparently was not for the rest of us. I left that negotiation chamber with a question turning over in my mind that I suspected would follow me for a very long time afterward. For 2 years, I had watched the coalition treat humanity as the weakest member of this alliance, a species to be tolerated rather than respected. I was beginning to understand that this assessment had never actually been about strength at all. It had been about restraint, about the quiet, deliberate choice to hold back capability that other species simply did not believe a young, unproven species like ours could possibly possess in the first place. The galaxy had spent years pitying humanity for being soft. I was starting to suspect they had simply never understood what that softness had actually been protecting all along. 6 months passed between the signing of the Thresher terms and the day the Concord Council formally reconvened to address what they called, in careful diplomatic language, the changing balance of the alliance. I spent most of those months traveling between coalition worlds as part of the ongoing oversight process for Thresher disarmament, watching alongside representatives from a dozen other species as the terms Colonel Hale had negotiated were slowly, methodically put into practice. It was strange, watching a species that had terrified the entire galaxy for years gradually withdraw from conquered territory, hand over weapons systems for coalition inspection, and begin the long, uncertain process of demonstrating that Vessel Speaker's promises had been genuine rather than simply a desperate stall for time. There were setbacks, disagreements, moments when I genuinely worried the entire arrangement might collapse, but it held, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that difficult things usually do when enough people on both sides are willing to keep trying. Throughout those months, I noticed something shifting in the way coalition officers spoke to me, and by extension, to every human they encountered. The pity was gone, mostly. In its place sat something more complicated, an uneasy blend of respect and caution that I had never once experienced before joining this alliance. Species that had barely acknowledged my presence during my first 2 years of service now sought me out specifically, asking careful questions about human history, about the wars my grandfather used to describe, about what exactly humanity had learned fighting itself that had prepared us so thoroughly for an enemy we had never even known existed. I answered as honestly as I could, though I found myself choosing my words more carefully than I once might have, aware now that every conversation carried weight it had never carried before. Humanity was no longer simply the newest, least significant member of the Concord. We had become something the rest of the Alliance did not fully understand, and I had come to realize, slowly, that being misunderstood in that particular way carried its own kind of danger, different from the dismissive pity we had grown used to, but no less serious. The Council's request for me to address the reconvened assembly arrived through official channels, formal and slightly stiff in its language, but I recognized the significance immediately. In the entire history of humanity's membership in the Concord, no human had ever addressed the full Council directly. We had always spoken through intermediaries, through liaison officers from other species, through channels that kept our voice one step removed from the actual center of coalition power. This time, they wanted to hear directly from a human, and they wanted it to be me. I spent 3 days preparing, discarding draft after draft of a speech that kept sounding either too defensive or too triumphant, neither of which felt honest to what I actually wanted the Council to understand. In the end, I abandoned prepared remarks entirely and decided simply to speak, the way Colonel Hale had spoken in that negotiation chamber, plainly and without unnecessary decoration. The Council chamber itself was larger than anything I had experienced aboard the Aurelian's Mercy, a circular hall ringed with representatives from every member species of the coalition. Dozens of delegates whose expressions ranged from open curiosity to the same wary uncertainty I had grown accustomed to seeing over the past 6 months. Captain Frost was present as well, seated among the Concord observers, and when our eyes met across that vast chamber, she offered me a small nod that steadied something in my chest before I even began to speak. Ambassador Voss, the presiding council chair, began, a Tessan representative whose translated voice carried the same formal weight I remembered from every official coalition proceeding I had ever witnessed. The Council has requested your perspective on recent events, and on what they suggest about the nature and history of your species. Please, proceed. I stood for a long moment before speaking, looking around that circular chamber at faces from a dozen worlds, all of them waiting to hear an explanation for something they had spent years assuming they already understood about humanity, and had recently discovered they did not understand at all. For as long as humanity has been part of this alliance, I began, we have been treated as the weakest member of the Concord. I do not say that with resentment. I understood why, and in many ways, I accepted it. our lifespans are shorter than most of yours. Our technology, when we first arrived among the stars, was less advanced by nearly every measure this council uses to evaluate a species' capability. We were new, we were untested, and we asked to join an alliance that had already been fighting for its survival for longer than our own recorded history. I paused, letting that settle across the chamber before continuing. What this council never asked, in all the years we have served alongside you, was why a species with so little advanced technology, so little apparent military sophistication, nonetheless managed to secure a place in this alliance at all. You assumed it was because you needed the numbers, because any additional species willing to fight against the Threshers was worth accepting regardless of how capable they actually were. And that assumption was not entirely wrong, but it was also not the whole truth. "Please, continue," the Tessin chair said, and I noticed several other delegates leaning forward slightly, an unmistakable gesture of genuine attention across nearly every species present. "Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself," I said. "Long before we ever encountered another species among the stars, we fought wars against our own kind that reshaped what we understood war to actually mean. We built weapons capable of ending our entire civilization, and then we had to learn, urgently and at enormous cost, how to hold those weapons in reserve rather than use them. We learned that capability and restraint were not opposites, but two halves of the same discipline, and that a species which could not master both would eventually destroy itself long before any external threat ever arrived to finish the job." I looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as I could across that vast circular space. When we joined this alliance, we brought that discipline with us, quietly, without announcing it, partly because we were not certain how the rest of you would respond to a species with a history like ours, and partly because we genuinely believed, at the time, that we would never need to demonstrate the full extent of what that history had taught us. We hoped, honestly, that we would simply serve alongside the rest of you as a smaller, less experienced partner, contributing what we could without ever needing to reveal capabilities we had spent generations learning to hold back rather than use. "And yet you revealed them at Haven Ridge," a Velkari delegate said, his translated voice carrying an edge of something between accusation and genuine curiosity. "We revealed them because we had no other choice," I said. "Because the alternative was watching 2 million people die on a world this council had already quietly decided was not worth defending. I want to be honest with this chamber about something that I do not think anyone here has fully acknowledged yet. The vote that decided not to reinforce Haven Ridge was not cruelty. It was simply an honest reflection of how this council valued human lives compared to the lives of more established member species. I do not say that to condemn anyone in this room. I say it because I think this council needs to understand exactly what humanity was responding to when we chose to reveal the full extent of our capability." The chamber had gone very quiet, and I could see, in the shifting postures of several delegates, that my words had landed with more weight than perhaps even I had intended. "We are not interested in punishing this alliance for that decision," I continued. "We understand why it was made, given everything the Council knew about our species at the time. But I do want this chamber to understand something clearly. Going forward, humanity chose restraint for a very long time, not because we lacked the capability to do otherwise, but because we believed, and still believe, that restraint is the foundation of any alliance worth maintaining. We showed you mercy at Haven Ridge, disabling rather than destroying an enemy fleet that had shown no such mercy to anyone across this entire war, because we believe mercy, freely chosen rather than forced by weakness, is what separates an alliance of equals from a coalition held together purely by fear." I let that statement rest in the silence of the chamber for a long moment before finishing. We are asking this council to reconsider how it evaluates the worth of its member species, not simply according to technological sophistication or fleet size, but according to what each species actually chooses to do with the capability it possesses. Humanity has capability this alliance never fully understood. We intend to keep exercising restraint with that capability, the same restraint we have always exercised, because that restraint has never been a limitation. It has always been a choice, and it remains one. When I finished speaking, the chamber remained silent for what felt like a very long time, delegates from a dozen worlds absorbing words that clearly reshaped something fundamental about how they understood the alliance they had built together. Eventually, the Tessin chair spoke again, and for the first time in every council session I had ever witnessed or heard described, the formal diplomatic language carried something that sounded almost like genuine humility. "The Council thanks Ambassador Voss for this perspective," the chair said. "We will take these words under serious consideration as we determine how membership evaluation processes should evolve going forward." I left the chamber that day, accompanied by Captain Frost, who fell into step beside me as we walked the long corridor leading away from the council hall, neither of us speaking for a long stretch of that walk. "You surprised them," she finally said. "I have sat through hundreds of council sessions in 60 years of service, and I have never seen that chamber go that quiet." "I only told them the truth," I said. "The truth is rarely quiet like that, unless it changes something fundamental about how people understand their own history," she replied. "You did not just explain what humanity did at Haven Ridge. You explained what humanity has always been capable of doing, and chosen not to, across your entire history as a species. That is a very different kind of truth to deliver to an entire alliance at once." We walked in silence for a while longer, and I found myself thinking back over the past year, from that first alarm on the bridge of the Aurelian's Mercy, through the strange, calm confidence of Earth Defense Command's initial reply, through the battle at Haven Ridge and the negotiation chamber where I had watched Colonel Hale offer mercy to an enemy that had shown none, to this final moment, standing in a council hall that had finally, genuinely, begun to see humanity as something other than the weakest member of an alliance built to survive. "Do you think it will hold?" I asked eventually. "The new terms with the Threshers, the Council's willingness to reconsider how it treats us, any of it." Frost considered the question carefully before answering, the way she considered most things, weighing 60 years of experience against the uncertainty of a future none of us could fully predict. "I think," she said finally, "that alliances built on fear are always fragile, because fear changes the moment the balance of power shifts even slightly. But I think an alliance built on demonstrated restraint, on a species proving repeatedly that it chooses mercy, even when it holds every advantage, has a chance to last far longer than anything held together purely by necessity." She stopped walking and turned to face me directly, her expression carrying none of the pity I remembered from our earliest days serving together, replaced now by something that looked, unmistakably, like respect freely given rather than diplomatically required. "For whatever it is worth, Ambassador," she said, "I am glad humanity chose to be kind when you clearly did not have to be." I thought about Haven Ridge, about the calm, unhurried voice of Colonel Hale guiding an entire colony through an engagement that should have ended in destruction, about the strange, quiet mercy shown to an enemy fleet that had never once shown mercy to anyone else. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about the terrible lessons humanity had learned fighting itself long before the stars ever opened up to us. Lessons that had taught us, above everything else, the enormous difference between what a species was capable of doing and what a species chose to do instead. "So am I," I said, and for the first time since joining this alliance, I felt, standing in that quiet corridor far from home, that I finally understood exactly what it meant to be human among the stars.